Welcome to the Mad.Forensic.Scientist. Be sure to smash that subscribe button. And now, the opioids. To dig back a little bit though, we're talking about the history of opioids. They've been used for pain relief for centuries, beginning when the opium poppy was first cultivated, as far back as ancient Sumer and Egypt. But in the modern era, opioids were used as morphine and codeine, especially started out in the Civil War, used to treat soldiers, and then now the rise of opioids in the U.S. Opioid use began to rise drastically in the 1990s. Pharmaceutical companies began to aggressively market painkillers such as Oxycontin to healthcare providers. Oxycontin is oxycodone, and these drugs were marketed as safe and effective for treating chronic pain. So doctors began prescribing them more frequently. By the early 2000s, it became clear that opioid painkillers were highly addictive and were being overprescribed. Regulations were put in place to restrict the access to these drugs, but many people who had already become addicted started to turn to illicit drugs such as heroin, which was cheaper and more readily available. So we saw a drastic increase in heroin abuse in the early 2000s. And then the rise of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, has contributed to the severity of the opioid crisis in recent years. Fentanyl is much stronger than heroin or the prescription opioids, 50 to 100 times more as potent as morphine, and is often mixed with other drugs, leading to a higher risk of overdose. So prescription opioids, specifically the prescription rates, the United States has one of the highest prescription rates of opioids in the world, and a lot of that's due to overprescribing and misuse. So overprescribing, opioids have been identified as a major contributor in the opioid crisis by overprescribing these opioids. In many cases, doctors prescribe opioids for chronic pain without adequately addressing the risk or benefits of these drugs and without considering alternative treatments, as well as incentives. So in some cases, healthcare providers may have received financial incentives to prescribe opioids, including payments from pharmaceutical companies or insurance companies that reward providers to achieve certain treatment targets. An example of this is a substance, where they created this substance, Insys, patented this substance, which is a spray for fentanyl. Under the tongue, you spray it in for acute opioid treatment or for pain. And they targeted doctors very strongly to incentivize them to prescribe this substance to make a profit. Their profits doubled from 2014 to 2015. They went from like 150 million to 300 million in a year, and it became such a big deal that the CEO was actually arrested and was sentenced like 10 years in prison. So check out the YouTube shorts. I have some YouTube shorts coming up for this substance. But incentives have been a big deal. So opioids are a big money-making product, but that caused a lot of issues. So it caused a lot of downstream effects of these opioids because they're so addictive. So why does that matter? Well, opioids are a class of drugs that are effective at binding to receptors in the brain and body. And these receptors are a natural part of the body's pain relief system, which includes endogenous opioids called endorphins. But these can be highly addictive both physically and psychologically. A lot of that has to do with how pain is felt in the body. So when something painful happens, like a muscle tear or neurons send signals to the brain that there's a problem, the body releases these endogenous opioids to regulate the pain response. These endorphins act to stop and slow down the pain so the body does not go into shock. So it's part of a natural reaction when there's pain to reduce that pain, to not let basically the endorphins are the stop signal. So how opioids reduce pain in the body? These endorphins bind to receptors as part of the body's natural relief system, and the opioids bind to these same receptors. They block the transmissions of pain and produce feelings of euphoria and relaxation. Problem is, these opioids are much better at binding to the receptors than our own endorphins. So there's 3 types of opioid receptors in the body: the mu, the delta, and the kappa. Each of these are located in different parts of the brain and the body. Specifically, the mu opioid receptors is the primary target of opioids. prescription opioids, illicit opioids, they like to target the mu opioid receptor. And this receptor is responsible for producing feelings of pain relief and euphoria. This receptor is also located in the parts of the brain involved in reward and motivation, as well as the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system. But the reward system is what's important, as the opioids can activate the brain's reward system as well, producing feelings of pleasure and motivation. So when these opioids bind to the mu receptor, they activate the VTA, which is the ventral tegmental area of the brain, which stimulates the release of dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is associated with pleasure. So as you know, you get quick dopamine release. As you get dopamine, you're going to want that more. So because opioids trigger in the pain response, they also release dopamine at the same time. And it's a vicious cycle of reward for the pain relief, which leads to dependence. So over repeated exposure to opioids can lead to changes in the brain's reward system, making it more difficult for a person to experience pleasure from natural rewards like food, sex, or social interaction. This contributes to the cycle of addiction, as individuals may continue to use opioids in order to avoid negative emotions and the physical symptoms associated with withdrawals. So as the person becomes more and more addicted, more and more dependent on the opioids, that's when addiction happens. So opioids affect multiple areas of the brain that's involved with decision making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. This chronic opioid abuse can impair these cognitive and emotional processes, making it more difficult for the individuals to control their drug use. And it makes it difficult for them to make rational decisions about their health and well-being. So once dependence becomes an addiction, they're no longer in control of their brain, essentially. So the pathways have become so tolerant, so immune to this, that if you actually remove the drug itself, the body has trouble regulating pain. So any touch, anything just starts to hurt. So they have an oversensitivity and they have this pain. So then they can't. They have a drop in serotonin, drop in dopamine. So they're very depressed. Their body's just in withdrawal, and just everything hurts. Everything's annoying, and that is so hard to overcome. And it just gets to the point where taking opioids is no longer about the pleasure. It's no longer about feeling pain relief per se. It's just about trying to reach normalcy. So once they become tolerant, once it becomes an addiction, then it's just to the point where just to maintain normal levels in the brain, they have to take the drug. Which of course then starts to lead to overdose. As you become more tolerant, as you need more and more of the drug, then you take more and more of the drug, and this can lead to a serious and life-threatening complication of opioid overdose. So this happens when you take too much or in combination of other drugs or alcohol, especially benzodiazepines and alcohol. This can cause respiratory depression to the point where it either causes brain damage or death if not treated properly. So Narcan, naloxone will help reverse an overdose of these opioids that help release it. But honestly, taking Narcan or Suboxone will actually initiate withdrawal. We'll get into withdrawal in another lecture, another time, maybe actually in the shorts. So keep an eye out for shorts. I'm gonna have a little more details in the shorts, as well as maybe future talks about opioids, digging into specifically more into the receptors, more into the ADMA or ADME, but synthetic overdose deaths. So I want to talk a little bit about why we know how the opioids work, but what about synthetic opioids has been driving this? So synthetic opioids death, in 2015 there were about 5,700 overdose deaths in the US. Last year alone there was 71,000. That is more than 10 times, it's about 12 times increase since 2015. So in a 7-year period it increased drastically. As you see here, way more than cocaine. Heroin abuse has actually decreased. Heroin overdose deaths have actually decreased, but synthetic opioid overdose deaths has been skyrocketing, even compared to overall overdose deaths. So synthetic overdose deaths are driving the opioid crisis, and they're driving overdose death in general. So they're driving up the deaths. So here in green is the overall total drug overdose death. As you see here, the synthetic opioids are increasing at the same rate, the same slope. So synthetic opioids are driving these drug overdose deaths. We had over 100,000 drug overdose deaths. I think we hit 110, I believe, thousand overdose deaths in 2022. And 71,000 of those were synthetic opioids. So fentanyl is driving this overdose deaths. So what do you want to see next? So that was the opioid crisis in a nutshell. Appreciate you guys watching. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Check out the community page. We do have a community page on YouTube. Check that out. Be sure to check out the shorts. The shorts have a lot of good information. So subscribe. That's the biggest thing, is click that subscribe button. Do it. 1,000 subscribers. That's all it is for me to run a half marathon. 1,000 subscribers. That's nothing. Come on. You guys can help me out. For the boys.